It's funny. Whenever you crack open, like, a high school biology textbook, or
Yeah.
you watch one of those science documentaries about the origin of life, there's this almost cinematic expectation of how it all happened.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The classic lightning strike.
Right. We're practically programmed to picture this incredibly turbulent ancient Earth. You imagine this volatile landscape, these violent storms, and a literal primordial soup.
Just a puddle of carbon and ammonia.
Exactly. Carbon, water, ammonia, just sort of randomly bumping into each other in the dark over millions and millions of years. And then the story goes, there is a lightning strike, right?
Sure.
The sudden surge of thermal energy, and out of nowhere, snap.
These completely lifeless molecules just magically stitch themselves together.
Yeah, a membrane forms, a metabolic engine just kicks on, and life miraculous pulls itself out of the chaotic mud.
It is an incredibly pervasive narrative, and honestly, it's comforting, largely because it feels so intuitive to our everyday experience. Well, I mean, we are used to baking a cake, right? Or
Right.
building a machine. We take raw ingredients, we add a spark of energy or heat, and we just assume that, given enough time, complexity will inevitably scale up into biology.
Oh, I see what you mean, like putting Lego bricks in a dryer and hoping a spaceship comes out.
Exactly. We treat atoms like they are tiny, inert Lego bricks that just need to be snapped together in the correct sequence.
It's the ultimate cosmic recipe. Just add electricity to the planetary crockpot and, well, wait. But the material we are doing a deep dive into today asked this question that honestly completely shattered how I view that entire sequence of events.
It's a fundamental shift in perspective.
It really is. What if staring at those chemicals,
Yeah.
the proteins, the amino acids, the lipid membranes, what if looking at that is actually looking at the very end of the story rather than the beginning?
That is the exact paradigm-breaking threshold we are crossing today.
Right.
We are stepping entirely outside the traditional chemistry-first biological narrative. We are asking a fundamental question about reality itself.
Which is such a massive swing.
Mhm. It is. The question is, before carbon and hydrogen could even attempt to build a living, breathing cell, what gave the universe the underlying geometric permission to allow life to exist in the first place?
Yeah. Why isn't the universe just filled with dead rocks and gas?
Exactly. Why is life even allowed?
And to answer that, our mission today is to unpack this staggeringly dense, entirely paradigm-shifting body of work by Philip Lillian. We are looking really closely at his overarching framework called panspatial genesis.
And specifically focusing on a text titled The Infratier Encoding of Life.
Right. I spent the entire weekend immersed in this, and I feel like my brain has been completely rewired. I mean, it reads less like an origin of life biology paper and more like a cosmic detective story,
That's a great way to put it.
trying to uncover the universe's hidden source code, basically. And the entire framework rests on one single massive thesis that we're going to explore today. And that thesis is this: life is chemically expressed, but geometrically admitted.
To truly grasp the weight of that thesis, we have to perform a rather difficult mental unlearning.
Which is not easy, by the way.
No, it takes work. We have to strip away the assumption that atoms and molecules are primitive, undeniable facts just floating around in a neutral, empty background of space.
Right, because that's how we're taught to think of space.
Yeah.
Just an empty box that stuff happens inside of.
Exactly. But Lillian's framework insists that molecules are not the starting point of reality. Before a single chemical reaction can be categorized as alive, the very fabric and geometry of space itself has to be sculpted.
Structured in a highly specific, mathematically rigorous way.
Yes.
Now, let me put a huge disclaimer on this right up front for anyone listening, because I had this exact same knee-jerk reaction. We are not dismissing chemistry here.
Not at all.
We're not saying that carbon bonds and cellular biology don't matter, but we are asking what makes chemistry capable of sustaining a living, reproducing, adaptive system.
Think of it like architecture.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
If the underlying geometry of space is the architect's blueprint, the physical chemistry, the atoms and molecules are just the bricks and mortar.
Right. You can dump 1,000,000 bricks onto an empty lot. You can even mortar them together into a highly complex, intricate structure. But without a specific blueprint governing airflow and thermal regulation and structural integrity,
Those bricks will never spontaneously assemble into a smart home that regulates its own temperature.
exactly. Chemistry flawlessly explains the material mechanism of life.
Yeah.
But a chemical reaction network isn't alive just because it is complicated.
Precisely. I mean, a diamond crystal has an incredibly complicated molecular structure, but it is definitively dead.
Definitively.
Mhm.
So in this deep dive, We are going to journey from pure, formless potential at the root of the universe down through descending layers of dimensional geometry into the birth of chemical matter.
And ultimately, we're going to trace the geometric origin of subjective, conscious experience itself.
Which is just wild. So let's start at the very beginning. And by the beginning, I don't mean the formation of the Earth. I mean the absolute foundational layer of reality.
Because to understand how geometry creates life, Lillian argues we have to start in a domain before geometry or shape even exists.
Right, the root. He calls this foundational layer omnilectic coherence, or C infinity.
If we're genuinely tracing the origin of life back to its absolute root, we have to start at what the framework calls continuum ontology.
Okay, continuum ontology. Break that down for us.
Imagine a state of invariant, undifferentiated, pure potential. It is a completely distributed field.
So no chunks, no pieces.
Exactly. It has no boundaries, it has no shape, there are no discrete objects, no atoms, no electrons, no planets, no cells. It is a state of perfect, unbroken unity.
So the term omnilectic implies, like, a totalizing, all-encompassing gathering of everything into a single, seamless continuum.
That's right.
If I'm picturing this, it's just everything everywhere all at once, but completely devoid of any distinguishing features. Just a smooth, infinite void of potential.
The challenge with a perfectly uniform field, however, is that nothing ever happens in it.
Right, it's too perfect.
If omnilectic coherence remains invariant, the universe remains a featureless void forever.
Nothing would ever change.
Exactly. For anything to exist, let alone something as highly structured as biological life, this pure field of potential must undergo a process Lillian identifies as coherence concentration.
Okay, let's try to visualize coherence concentration, because I needed an analogy for this one. Imagine a perfectly still, infinite ocean.
A great visual.
That ocean represents our omnilectic coherence. The water is totally flat, like glass, stretching out infinitely in every direction. But suddenly, for whatever reason, in one specific localized spot, the water starts to gather.
It begins to concentrate.
Yeah, it begins to pull together almost as if it's draining downward. And the second that happens, you no longer have a featureless flat ocean.
You have a difference.
Right, you have a difference. You have an area with dense pulling water and an area of relatively calm water further away.
And that concept of difference is the engine of all physical reality. In the terminology of the text, that difference is called a gradient.
A gradient.
When coherence concentrates, it immediately generates a gradient. Gradients are, at their core, simply differences in density across a field.
And the generative sequence that kicks off from this single gradient is absolutely fascinating.
It's cascade.
Yeah. By simply having a high-density area and a low-density area, you inherently generate directionality. The field is no longer neutral or symmetrical. It suddenly has an orientation.
There is a flow from low to high density.
Right. The surrounding water is now being pulled toward our ocean drain. But in nature, fluids or fields moving toward a concentration point don't just travel in perfectly straight, polite little lines, do they?
No, never. They crash and jostle.
Right.
They never move in perfectly straight lines because the concentration itself is never perfectly uniform from all angles.
Ah, okay.
The text refers to this as anisotropic flow, meaning the properties of the flow are uneven depending on the direction.
Okay, so when you have uneven flow pulling toward a center, the flow begins to twist.
Yes, and this twisting introduces one of the most profound geometric properties in the universe.
Torsion. Torsion. So our simple ocean drain has now evolved into a twisting, spiraling whirlpool.
But a twisting flow is inherently volatile. I mean, it can easily collapse back into the surrounding ocean.
Sure, it could just fade out.
Exactly. However, if that twisting flow stabilizes into a persistent, asymmetrical pattern, we arrive at the next vital property in the sequence, which is chirality.
Chirality, which simply means handedness.
Right. Correct. It means the whirlpool isn't just twisting randomly. It has settled into a specific, stable direction of spin.
So it is consistently spinning left-handed, or it is consistently spinning right-handed.
Yes, it locks into an orientation.
And here's where it really clicks for me. Once that whirlpool is spinning stably with a specific handedness, it creates a very clear physical distinction in the ocean.
Separation.
Exactly. There is the violently spinning water caught inside the funnel of the whirlpool, and there is the calm, flat water existing outside of it. It has created a literal inside and an outside.
Which brings us to the final crucial step in this foundational sequence. Boundary.
Bound.
That stabilized concentration forms a closure surface. The boundary is what distinguishes the localized, twisting interior from the ambient background of the ocean.
Wow.
And we need to pause here because this represents a massive ontological shift in how we understand reality.
Yeah, let's unpack that because it's huge.
Discreteness, the idea that individual things exist as separate objects in the universe, is not some fundamental fragmentation. Objects are not primitive facts of reality.
They aren't just things that are fundamentally separate.
Right. Discreteness is the stabilized manifestation of localized coherence closure. An object is literally a sustained act of concentration.
I really want the listener to sit with that idea for a second. An object is a sustained act of concentration.
It's an ongoing process.
The chair you were sitting on, the phone you were holding, they aren't just solid things that were dropped into an empty universe. They are ongoing geometric events.
They are localized areas where the universe is actively gathering and closing off from the background.
So just by allowing a featureless ocean to concentrate, we have sequentially generated gradients, directionality, torsion, chirality, and a boundary.
And those specific properties are the absolute foundation of everything that follows.
Right.
Because now that we have twisting, handed, bounded concentrations, we must transition from the concept of a pure field into the realm of mathematics.
We have to ask, what specific kind of geometry is actually generated by these twisting, bounded concentrations?
Because it certainly isn't the geometry you or I learned in high school.
No, we aren't just drawing triangles on a flat chalkboard anymore. This brings us to a massively important, incredibly dense concept in the text. FCHP geometry.
It stands for Finsler Coherence Hyperfractal Phase Geometry.
And we cannot just gloss over that acronym because there are a lot of big words there. We need to break down exactly what each of those words means if we're going to understand how space permits life.
Let's dismantle it piece by piece, because FCHP geometry is not some abstract mathematical grid that Lillian arbitrarily invented to overlay onto the universe.
It's not just a theoretical model.
No, it is the inescapable geometry that is naturally generated when coherence concentrates in the way we just described.
Okay, let's start with the first letter. F, Finsler. Why is this a Finsler geometry?
Well, standard 3D space, the kind we use to measure the square footage of a room, is called Riemannian geometry.
I actually had to look this up. In normal space, if you measure the distance from point A to point B, it is exactly the same as the distance from point B to point A.
A space is symmetrical. The distance doesn't care which direction you are facing.
Right. But Finsler space is different. In a Finsler geometry, distance and metric properties are highly dependent on direction.
Yes, and let's apply that to biology. If space were perfectly symmetrical, a biological cell could not function.
Why not?
A cell membrane must be semi-permeable. It must allow nutrients to easily pass inside, but it must vigorously prevent those same nutrients from leaking back out.
Oh, I see.
So the distance or resistance moving inward is radically different from the resistance moving outward. Biological life fundamentally relies on directional asymmetry.
Oh, that is mind-blowing. So Finsler geometry provides the mathematical framework where space itself possesses an inherent directional bias.
Exactly.
Okay, the C is coherence, which we know comes from the underlying concentration of the pure field. What about the H, hyperfractal?
Hyperfractal refers to the scale invariant nature of this geometry.
Meaning it works at any size.
Exactly. It means the geometric rules do not just apply at one specific size and vanish at another. A fractal repeats its patterns whether you zoom into the microscopic level or zoom out to the macroscopic level.
Okay.
The twisting bounded closure happens at the scale of a single subatomic particle. It happens at the scale of a lipid membrane, and it happens at the scale of an entire planetary ecosystem. The geometry nests within itself infinitely.
And finally, the P for phase.
Yeah.
FCHP.
Phase introduces the concept that a geometric position is not static. A point in FCHP geometry doesn't just sit at a location. It exists at a specific state within a recurring cycle.
As a cycle.
It implies rhythm, pulse, and oscillation, which, as we'll see later, is the geometric precursor to a biological heartbeat or metabolic cycle.
So when you put it all together, Finsler coherence hyperfractal phase geometry, you get a space that has directional bias, is connected to the fundamental field, repeats at every scale, and possesses an inherent cyclic rhythm.
Yes. The text argues that ordinary 3D space is insufficient for life because it only describes distance and bending. But FCHP creates what Lillian calls life-admissible space.
Life-admissible space. And that dictates that before biological life can exist, the underlying space must possess 4 strict geometric preconditions. We have touched on their origins, but let's formalize them. First is torsion. directed internal twist.
Right.
If I think about a biological system, it is never a static flat sheet. Torsion provides internal orientation.
Think about how an enzyme works in the body.
Yeah, an enzyme doesn't just bump into a molecule and magically process it. The molecule has to physically slot into the enzyme in a highly specific, twisted orientation, like a key entering a lock.
Torsion gives the geometry an internal directedness that allows life to organize itself mechanically.
Okay, the second precondition is chirality, stable-handed asymmetry.
In our biological reality, molecular chirality is ubiquitous. The DNA double helix always twists in a specific direction.
The amino acids that make up the proteins in your body are overwhelmingly left-handed in their molecular structure, right? While naturally occurring sugars are right-handed.
Yes. Traditional biology treats this as a quirky chemical accident that happened early in Earth's history and just got locked in.
It's just a coin flip that landed on tails and stayed that way?
Right. But Lillian's text argues something much deeper. Molecular chirality is not a chemical accident at all. It is the direct material expression of the geometric chirality generated by FCHP space. The space itself is handed.
The space is handed.
That is so cool.
Okay, the third precondition is boundary. A closure surface distinguishing an interior from the ambient background.
And this one is highly intuitive.
Very. If you don't have a boundary, you don't have an organism, you just have an uncontained soup of chemicals diluting into the ocean.
Exactly.
But the fourth requirement is where I actually found myself questioning the text a bit. The fourth precondition is gradient retention.
The ability to preserve a difference without letting it immediately dissipate.
Right. Now, if the entire goal of this geometry is to create a safe harbor for life to exist, why wouldn't it just construct a perfectly sealed, impenetrable vault? A leak, or an ongoing gradient, sounds like a geometric failure. It sounds like the boundary is broken.
It is tempting to think of perfection as a totally sealed vault. But consider what happens inside a flawless vault.
Nothing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a system is completely closed off from its environment, if nothing enters and nothing exits, it rapidly burns through whatever internal energy it has, and then it stops.
It just hits equilibrium.
It reaches thermodynamic equilibrium. It becomes a crystal or a stone. A stone possesses remarkable physical persistence, but it does not possess life. A flawless vault is a tomb.
Okay, so if the boundary locks down completely, the system dies.
Life is fundamentally a state of managed disequilibrium. It must perpetually preserve a gradient between its interior and exterior, like a battery desperately holding onto a charge.
But it must also allow a highly controlled exchange across that boundary to fuel the gradient.
Yes. Gradient retention is the absolute geometric prerequisite for metabolism.
Because a living cell is constantly pumping sodium out and potassium in to maintain an electrical difference.
Exactly. FCHP geometry provides the permission structure for a boundary to hold a gradient securely without letting it instantly wash away into the background equilibrium.
I see. It has to be sealed enough to have an identity, but open enough to breathe.
Precisely.
So to recap where we are in the cosmic sequence, we started with a featureless ocean of pure coherence. It concentrated, twisted, and formed a chiral boundary.
Which generated FCHP geometry.
Right. Which lays down the mathematical rules, the permission structure for torsion, chirality, boundaries, and gradient retention.
But here is the massive gap we have to cross.
Right. Because we have abstract geometric rules on one side,
Yes.
and we have a physical carbon-based living cell on the other side. How does an abstract mathematical rule actually translate into a physical heavy atom?
There has to be a physical bridge, a translation mechanism, and this introduces one of the most critical conceptual frameworks in the text, the atomic continuum ontology, or ACO.
ACO.
Yeah.
Let's lay out the full spectrum of these ontological layers because the terminology gets really dense here.
It does.
On one extreme, we have CO continuum ontology. That is the omnilectic coherence we started with, the pure, distributed, infinite field of potential with no boundaries and no particles.
Correct.
On the exact opposite extreme, we have AO, atomic ontology. That is the world we interact with daily.
It is a realm of stable atoms, localized molecules, solid rocks, and physical chemistry.
Right, so the ACO, the atomic continuum ontology, is the transition regime sitting right between them.
Think of ACO as the domain of partial closure. The coherence is no longer a totally distributed infinite field, but it hasn't fully locked down into stable, persistent, rigid atomic matter yet.
It's still deciding what to be.
It is a highly turbulent transition zone. It exhibits quantum-like indeterminacy. It is attempting to form proto-boundaries, but those boundaries aren't fully sealed into physical matter.
It is the active furnace, where abstract geometry is trying to figure out how to project itself as physical mass.
Exactly.
When I was trying to wrap my head around this state of matter, the best analogy I could come up with was a pond freezing over in the winter.
Oh, the slush.
Yes, think of that slushy, turbulent state between liquid water and solid ice. It is no longer a fully fluid, unbroken continuum, but it also isn't a rigid, solid block of ice that you can walk on either.
It's in between.
It's this messy middle domain where the crystalline rules of the solid state are actively being negotiated and formed, but haven't fully locked in.
The slush analogy perfectly captures the transitionary physics of the ACO. The molecules in the slush are partially constrained, partially closed, but still deeply engaged in the transition process.
Yeah.
In Lillian's precise terminology, if chemistry, the atomic ontology, is the material alphabet of life, then this transition zone, the ACO, is the underlying grammar of admissibility.
The grammar of admissibility. That makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can have all 26 letters of the alphabet sitting on a table, but without grammar, without structural rules dictating how those letters can combine, orient, and relate to one another, you cannot write a cohesive sentence.
Let alone a multi-volume novel like a biological organism.
Exactly. And this highlights exactly why the framework argues so forcefully that chemistry-only origin of life models are fundamentally flawed.
They are. A standard chemistry model looks at the primordial soup and assumes the atoms are just pre-existing primitives ready to be assembled like Lego bricks. It lacks any explicit ontology of transition.
You cannot simply mash atoms together using heat and lightning and expect them to certainly invent the capacity to hold complex metabolic gradients.
The underlying FCHP geometry must pass through this ACO transition domain. It has to become what the text calls chemically projectable.
The grammar must be written into the slush before the ice can form into a structured shape.
Yes.
So the geometry is essentially writing the behavioral rules into the matter
Right.
as it physically condenses. But how exactly does it execute that programming? How do we step down from a pure geometric continuum into localized physical chemistry?
Because the text gets incredibly specific and mathematical here.
Oh, very mathematical.
It introduces a dimensional cascade called the infratier reduction.
The infratier reduction. Okay, walk us through this.
The infratier reduction is one of the most mechanically detailed sections of the text. It maps the specific dimensional pathway where abstract geometric conditions are progressively stabilized, step by descending step, into algebraic signatures.
Right, and the text refers to these signatures as generators.
Yes. We're literally moving down a dimensional stack, starting from higher fractional dimensions and stepping downward toward the physical 3D reality we inhabit.
Before we go down the stack, we need to clarify what a generator is for you listening, because when the text says this layer brings 3 generators, it isn't talking about like a diesel engine producing electricity.
No. In mathematics, specifically in group theory, a generator is essentially a fundamental rule of transformation.
Right. It is a specific dimension of rotational or transformational freedom. It defines how a geometric shape can move, twist, or alter its internal state while still maintaining its overall structure.
That is an excellent way to frame it. Generators are the distinct degrees of freedom required to build the complexity of life.
Okay.
And the infratier reduction begins at the very top of the stack, at a layer the text identifies as the 3.14D gateway.
3.14 dimensions, which instantly makes anyone think of the mathematical constant pi.
The connection to pi is absolutely intentional, as we will explore shortly. The 3.14D gateway is described in the framework as the coherence curvature equilibrium.
Okay.
What is mathematically fascinating here is that this level does not possess a generator algebra yet. It is a pre-generator threshold.
So what's happening there?
It represents the exact dimensional point where linear, infinite extension finally begins to bend and curve into a cyclic return.
Ah.
It is the gateway where the infinite field curves enough that a closed shape becomes theoretically possible.
It's the gateway where the universe learns how to draw a circle.
Yes, beautifully put.
So from the 3.14D gateway, we step down slightly to the 3.00D threshold. The text calls this layer phase spatial coemergence.
And this is the layer where our first actual generators appear. We receive the mathematical groups SO3 and U1.
Okay, let's break down the physical meaning of those groups, because they form the baseline of our reality. SO3 brings 3 generators.
In physics, SO3 is the special orthogonal group that provides stable spatial orientation.
This is the classic 3-dimensional space we navigate every day, the freedom to rotate up and down, left and right, forward and backward.
Exactly. It gives a geometric system a stable physical location and the ability to orient itself in space.
That covers the spatial part of the coemergence.
Yeah.
But alongside it, we get U1,
Mm-hmm.
and U1 brings exactly one generator, and the text explicitly states that this provides cyclic phase closure.
Right.
Now, when I first read phase and cycle, my immediate assumption was that U1 is just a complicated mathematical way of describing the arrow of time. It's just the clock ticking. But reading further, that interpretation seems to be entirely wrong.
It is a very common misinterpretation, but the distinction is critical for biology. U1 is not linear time marching forward from past to future.
Okay.
It is the phase temporal companion to space. It is the inherent geometric ability for a system to cycle, to pulse, to recur internally while maintaining its identity.
Think of a metronome.
Or an oscillating wave. Biological closure fundamentally requires both spatial location and the ability to maintain internal phase identity.
Oh, so a biological organism isn't just a 3D object that happens to exist in time. It is an object that generates its own internal cycle.
Yes.
You cannot have biological life without a heartbeat, without the inhale and exhale of a breath, without the cyclical burning of a cellular metabolic cycle.
Yeah.
Life requires a recurrent pulse.
It's mandatory.
So a dead rock has SO3 spatial location. It occupies space perfectly fine, but it completely lacks U1 cyclic phase closure in a biological sense. It just sits there.
Right.
But a living cell physically exists in SO3, but it continually cycles and pulses through U1 to stay alive.
Precisely. At the 3.00D threshold, we have established space and we have established pulse. We have a total of 4 generators, 3 from space, 1 from phase.
However, a pulsing sphere of spatial geometry is still not a living cell. It is symmetrical and inert.
We still lack the crucial twist and the sealed boundary we identified as FCHP preconditions earlier.
Which means the descent isn't over.
Right.
We have to push deeper down the dimensional stack. We have to enter what the text calls the critical life encoding zone, moving from 2.85D down to 2.70D.
At the 2.85D level, we enter the torsional chiral regime. This layer introduces the mathematical group SU2, which brings an additional 3 generators. Recall how the 3.00D threshold gave us space, but life requires directed internal orientation.
Right, the twist.
SU2 is the geometric mechanism that takes that spatial closure and twists it into handedness. It introduces highly complex spinorial bivector relations.
Let's try to visualize how a mathematical group forces chirality. In physics, an SU2 spinor is notoriously bizarre because if you rotate it 360 degrees a full circle, it doesn't return to its original state.
Which breaks our brain a bit.
It really does. You actually have to rotate it 720 degrees, 2 full circles to get back to where you started. It has an inherent, deeply embedded twist.
Yes.
And this 2.85D layer is the geometric origin of that chirality we discussed.
Right.
It is the reason a carbon atom will bond with other atoms to form a left-handed amino acid rather than the symmetrical one.
The underlying 2.85D geometry literally twists the physical bonding slots into a handed orientation.
It dictates the blueprint of biological selectivity.
But even with the twisting, handed, pulsing shape, we have a problem. A twisting funnel of water is still entirely open at the top and bottom.
Right, it has not fully sealed itself off from the background ocean.
To achieve total closure, we must step down to the absolute bottom of the structural stack, the 2.70D layer.
The text calls 2.70D the confinement closure regime, and this layer brings the group SU3, adding a massive 8 new generators to the stack.
Handedness alone is insufficient for survival. It must be sealed to persist against the equilibrium of the environment.
So it has to be locked down.
SU3 represents the confinement regime where the torsional chirality finally becomes fully bounded. Think of it conceptually like the strong nuclear force that binds quarks together inside a proton. It provides absolute confinement.
Absolute confinement.
At 2.70D, the boundary is mathematically completed. And this is the exact threshold where the geometry finally becomes, as the text states, chemically projectable.
Maybe.
2.70D is the lowest structural layer required to project abstract geometric rules into persistent heavy atomic realities.
Let's pause and tally up the math of this entire stack because it forms a very specific toolset.
Let's do it.
We have 1 generator from U1 providing phase pulse. We add 3 generators from SO3 providing 3D space. We add 3 generators from SU2 providing chiral twist. And we add 8 generators from SU3 providing boundary confinement.
1 plus 3 plus 3 plus 8.
Which equals exactly 15 generators. This is the 15-generator life-admissibility stack.
And this specific number leads to a highly controversial and debated aspect of the text. This 15-generator domain is mathematically described as occupying an overarching SU4 coherence envelope.
Okay, SU4.
If you calculate the dimension of an SU4 group, the formula is 4 squared minus 1, 16 minus 1 is 15. It perfectly encapsulates the entire stack.
Now, when I saw the term SU4 used to describe the entire system, I immediately wondered, wait, is Lillian proposing a brand new fifth fundamental force of physics?
A lot of people jump to that conclusion.
Because we have gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force. Is he saying there is a biological SU4 force field permeating the universe?
The text explicitly denies that interpretation.
It does.
SU4 is absolutely not a new physical force gauge that you could measure with a particle accelerator. Lillian defines it as an algebraic horizon or a coherence envelope.
Okay, so it's a boundary condition, not a force.
Exactly. The critical point is that the 15-generator stack must remain fully decomposed within that envelope. It must strictly operate as 1 plus 3 plus 3 plus 8. It cannot merge into a single unified 15.
And why is that separation so vital?
Because biological life utterly depends on the functional distinctions between those generators. Phase pulse is fundamentally different from spatial location.
Right.
Causality is completely distinct from a sealed boundary. If those generators collapsed and merged into one unified SU4 superforce, the highly specific, distinct geometric permissions required to run a metabolism and fold a protein would vanish.
So the envelope provides the total mathematical capacity,
Yeah.
but the decomposed, separated stack provides the actual usability. Think of it like a master mechanic's toolbox. The SU4 envelope is the metal toolbox itself, designed to perfectly hold exactly 15 tools.
I like that.
But you would never take all 15 tools, the hammers, the wrenches, the screwdrivers, and melt them down into one giant, unified, 15-pound chunk of useless metal.
It would be completely useless.
To actually build a complex engine, you need the hammer to remain a hammer, separate from the wrench. You need the 1, the 3, and the 8 to stay functionally distinct to build a living cell.
A perfect analogy. The distinct functional roles must be preserved for geometry to project successfully into matter.
Now, I know we have been wading through incredibly abstract math, dimensional reduction, generator algebras, SU groups. It can feel disconnected from the physical world.
It can feel very theoretical.
But this is where the framework takes a breathtaking turn. The text argues that this abstract dimensional descent leaves behind actual numerical scars or residues that we can measure in the real world.
Yes.
These residues are what we call mathematical constants.
Think about constants like pi or Euler's number E. In standard physics and mathematics, we often just accept these constants as arbitrary infinite numbers that happen to make our equations balance.
We don't ask why pi is 3.14. It just is.
Right. But in Lillian's framework, constants are radically redefined. They are invariant geometric residues of the coherence transition we just walked through.
They are the stable mathematical traces permanently etched into reality as geometry stepped down to become matter.
Let's look at how the text maps these constants. First, the most famous one, pi, 3.14159.
Everyone knows pi.
The framework maps pi directly to the 3.14D gateway at the top of the stack. It represents the ultimate signature of curvature, of rotation, of infinite linear extension finally bending into a cyclic return.
Pi is the mathematical boundary condition that allows closure to begin.
Exactly. Then we have E, Euler's number, which is approximately 2.718.
2.718.
In standard mathematics, E is the constant of continuous growth, compounding interest, and limit formation.
Right.
In Lillian's framework, E is redefined as the constant of recursive emergence.
Recursive emergence.
It is the numerical logic through which an inert, closed boundary learns how to become dynamic. It is the geometric signature of metabolism and organic growth.
To give a tangible example of E for everyone listening, think about a bank account.
Good example.
If you compound your interest annually, you get a certain amount. If you compound it monthly, you get more. If you compound it continuously every fraction of a microsecond, the growth doesn't shoot up to infinity. It hits a mathematical ceiling. A limit.
The speed limit.
And that limit is exactly 2.718 times your original amount. It is the universe's ultimate speed limit for continuous compounding growth.
And that concept of continuous compounding exchange is exactly what a biological metabolism is doing across a cell membrane.
Wow.
We also see phi, the golden ratio, mapped as the signature of proportional optimization and nested organic scaling.
Which dictates the spiral of a nautilus shell or the arrangement of leaves on a stem, right?
Exactly. And the Feigenbaum constants, which govern chaos theory and bifurcation. They mark the exact mathematical threshold where a closed system can bifurcate into recursive complexity without completely dissolving into chaotic noise.
Life exists perpetually balanced on that microscopic edge.
It does.
But out of all the mathematics in this text, there is one specific calculation that absolutely floored me. I actually sat with a calculator on my desk running the numbers over and over because I couldn't believe it.
It's a stunning calculation.
It relates directly to that 2.70D confinement layer. We discussed the final threshold where the boundary seals in chemistry becomes possible. Let's walk through the mechanics of this calculation together.
It begins by examining the 3.0G spatial capacity regime. In a strictly spatial context, what is the squared capacity of a three-dimensional system?
Well, 3 squared is 9, so 9 represents the absolute numerical capacity of spatial dimension.
Correct. But to achieve a closed biological boundary, the geometry must subtract a full cyclic, turning a complete rotation from that pure spatial capacity to seal the shape. Mathematically, what represents a full cyclic turning?
A full circle in radians is 2 times pi. So the calculation takes the spatial capacity of 9 and subtracts the full rotation of 2 pi.
Right.
If you run the math, 9 minus 6.28318, you get a remaining value of roughly 2.7168.
And the text refers to the specific value as a curvature-subtracted spatial residue.
2.7168. When I saw that number, my jaw dropped. Tell the listener why that specific decimal is so paradigm-shattering.
What mathematical constant operates as the signature of biological growth and metabolism, sitting at approximately 2.718?
Euler's constant, E 2.71828.
Yes.
The difference between the geometric residue of our spatial boundary calculation, 2.7168, and the absolute biological constant of life, E 2.71828, is an infinitesimal margin of only 0.000146.
The implications of that proximity are staggering.
It's almost perfect.
It mathematically demonstrates that the 2.7 AD confinement layer, the exact dimensional depth where a geometric boundary seals itself and allows physical chemistry to project, sits perfectly flawlessly positioned at the threshold of Euler limit emergence.
The near-E transition zone.
This is not a coincidence.
No.
It implies that biological emergence is not some random lucky chemical fluke that occurred in a mud puddle. Biological growth has a deeply embedded, highly precise numerical prehistory built directly into the fabric of dimensional space.
It is absolute mathematical poetry. The geometry of the universe reduces in dimension, curves in on itself, mathematically subtracts its own rotation to seal a boundary, and in doing so, lands exactly on the numerical doorstep of biological growth.
It sets the stage perfectly.
Okay, so we have finally hit the 2.70D floor. The boundaries are strictly confined. The geometry is fully life-admissible. Now, at long last, this FCHP geometry crosses the turbulent slush of the ACO transition zone and hardens into actual physical matter.
Yes, the abstract rules of geometry become the tangible molecules of chemistry.
This is the domain of AO, or atomic ontology chemistry.
AO is the localized, stabilized, rigid material expression of all the prior complex closure geometry we just mapped. And the brilliance of Lillian's text here is that it provides a direct one-to-one mapping from the abstract geometric law to the physical chemical alphabet. It shows exactly how geometry physically forces atoms to behave.
I want to spend time walking through these mechanical mappings because this is where the highly abstract math finally puts its boots on the ground. First, let's look at FCHP torsion. We define torsion as a directed internal twist in the geometry. How does an abstract twist physically manifest in chemistry?
Chemically, torsion projects as molecular folding and fit.
Okay, like protein folding.
Exactly. A protein is a long chain of amino acids, but it is useless until it folds into a highly specific, complex, three-dimensional knot. Standard biology struggles to explain how a protein knows exactly how to fold into the correct shape in milliseconds.
Right, it's called the protein folding problem.
Yes. The text argues that the protein is simply following the path of least resistance laid down by the underlying torsion of the space it occupies. The geometric stress literally dictates the bond angles in the folding sequence.
So the twist of the space physically forces the molecule into a knot.
Makes so much sense. Next mapping, FCHP chirality. That stabilized handedness we inherited from the 2.85D SU2 level. How does SU2 math force a chemical outcome?
Chirality projects directly into the atomic world as stereochemistry.
Stereochemistry.
As we discussed with the SU tusk spliners, the geometry itself is handed. Therefore, when a carbon atom attempts to bond with 4 other groups to form an amino acid, the geometric slots available for those bonds are asymmetric.
The physical space heavily favors a left-handed configuration.
Exactly. The handed molecular selectivity of enzymes where a left-handed molecule will only lock into a left-handed receptor is the literal atomic embodiment of the prior SU2 geometric twist.
It's like trying to put your right hand into a left-handed glove. The glove is the physical chemistry, but the shape of the glove is dictated by the geometry.
That's a great way to look at it.
Third mapping, FCHP boundary. The closure surface from the 2.70D SU3 layer. This projection is highly visual and direct. The geometric requirement for an inside and an outside physically manifests as lipid bilayers and cellular membranes.
Right, the walls of the cell.
A lipid molecule has a head that loves water and a tail that hates water. When they cluster together, they automatically form a sealed spherical bubble. That fatty wall protecting the cell is the physical materialization of the geometric boundary.
Fourth mapping, FCHP gradient retention. The ability to preserve a difference without losing it to equilibrium.
Chemically, this abstract retention becomes the physical charge and proton gradients pumped across those very lipid membranes.
Ah, okay.
It projects as the osmotic and redox gradients that organelles like mitochondria utilize. The mitochondria use the membrane to physically separate protons, creating a battery charge that powers ATP synthase.
The molecular turbine that produces the energy currency of the cell.
Exactly. The geometry permits the gradient. The mitochondria physically execute it.
And finally, the fifth mapping, FCHP phase recurrence. That U1 cyclic pulse we established way back in the 3.00D level.
This cyclic geometry becomes the physical reality of catalysis and metabolic cycles.
Cycles, right.
It manifests as cyclical reaction pathways, like the Krebs cycle in cellular respiration, where a chemical sequence loops back on itself perfectly. It also dictates the oscillatory rhythmic behaviors of biological clocks and circadian rhythms.
The internal biological clock is chemistry recurring in geometric phase.
Yes.
So returning to the architecture analogy from the start of our deep dive, if geometry is the architect's blueprint mapping the airflow and load-bearing walls, chemistry really is just the physical bricks, the mortar, and the wiring.
It is, but we must expand the implications of that reality.
How so?
The text makes a profound ontological point here. A molecule is not alive merely because it possesses a complex structure. A chemical reaction network is not alive merely because it is complicated.
Right, like the diamond crystal.
Exactly. Chemistry is the necessary physical medium for biological expression, but chemistry alone does not explain the admissibility of life. A lipid membrane is made of chemistry, but the concept of a boundary is ontology.
That's a big distinction.
The physical membrane is merely the material embodiment of the universe's deeper geometric permission to possess an isolated identity at all.
Okay, so we have successfully manufactured the chemical bricks. We have complex folded proteins. We have left-handed stereochemistry. We have a sealed lipid membrane, and we have a proton gradient acting as a battery.
Yes, all the pieces are there.
But a highly organized pile of specialized bricks is still not a living, breathing, responding house. How does this static chemical projection finally ignite? How does it cross the threshold from complex chemistry to a living biological entity?
This final ignition is the shift into what Lillian calls DO, or derived ontology.
Derived ontology.
It occurs when a highly structured chemical system becomes entirely adaptive. The framework provides a staggeringly precise definition of biological life.
Let's hear it.
It defines life as an adaptive, self-maintaining, chiral-bounded gradient closure.
Wow. Adaptive, self-maintaining, chiral-bounded gradient closure. That is a dense sentence. Let's examine the word adaptive because it seems to be the tipping point. Adaptive boundary closure. This means our lipid membrane cannot just be a dumb wall.
Exactly right. A passive boundary, like the plastic wall of a Tupperware container, simply separates the inside from the outside. An adaptive boundary actively regulates.
That's so smart.
It contains sensors. It preserves the internal coherence of the cell while simultaneously monitoring and controlling its exchange with the chaotic environment.
So it selectively opens ion channels to let essential nutrients in and actively pumps toxic waste out.
Yes. It senses heat or toxicity and mechanically reacts to protect the closure.
And the concept of metabolism. We established it relies on gradient retention, but metabolism is more than just a battery holding a charge.
Metabolism is not a random sequence of chemicals colliding in a soup. It is the highly adaptive, controlled modulation of those preserved gradients.
The active use of it.
It is the sophisticated biological use of disequilibrium. A living system securely holds a thermodynamic gradient and carefully bleeds off fractions of that energy to perform physical work, to repair membrane damage, and to fuel growth.
The system also has to survive across time, which requires inheritance and regulation.
In the language of closure geometry, inheritance is simply closure continuity stretched across the dimension of time.
DNA?
DNA and RNA molecules are the highly stable chemical instruments utilized to accurately transmit the complex life-maintaining closure constraints from the parent cell to the daughter cell.
And regulation?
Regulation is the ultimate expression of recursive boundary intelligence. An adaptive system doesn't just change when poked, it changes how it changes in response to ongoing feedback loops. It constantly repairs and optimizes its own geometry.
And when all of those incredibly complex functions fuse together, the FCHP geometry, the atomic chemistry, the adaptive regulation, we finally arrive at the biological cell.
The single cell is the first robust, autonomous unit of derived ontology.
But pointing out this entire mechanical sequence brings up a massive philosophical implication. In this framework, life is definitely not a substance. There is no magical life juice, no mystical élan vital that gets poured into a test tube of chemicals to make them wiggle. Life is an action.
It is a highly specific, ongoing behavior.
That behavioral definition is the very essence of the panspatial claim. Life is a dynamic condition of closure that intentionally remains open just enough to continue existing.
Yes, an organism physically exists as heavy mass in metric space. But a living organism must simultaneously maintain its coherent identity across rhythmic phase space, across a vast chemical state space, across informational space via DNA, and across complex ecological relation space.
It's balancing everywhere all at once.
Life is a staggering multi-domain closure system actively balancing on a razor's edge.
Okay, take a breath. We have conceptually built a living, adaptive biological cell.
We made it.
We journeyed from the infinite, featureless ocean of pure coherence, stepped down the incredibly complex 15-generator dimensional stack, physically projected those rules into chemical membranes and left-handed proteins, and ignited an adaptive metabolism.
A huge journey.
But anyone who has read Philip Lillian's text knows that the paper does not stop at the living cell, does it?
Yeah.
The framework takes one final, audacious step. And this last descent is arguably the most staggering, mind-bending paradigm shift in the entire deep dive.
It truly is, because our journey followed the inferior dimensional stack down to the 2.70D confinement closure regime to establish the physical boundaries and chemistry of biological life.
Right.
But the mathematical framework proposes that the dimensional reduction does not actually stop at 2.70D.
It goes deeper.
The reduction descends even lower, dropping beneath physical chemistry into a deeply mysterious zone the text names the qualionomic band.
Qualionomics, a term combining economics or laws with qualia. For anyone listening who might be unfamiliar with philosophy of mind, qualia is the technical term for our subjective conscious experience of reality.
It is the elusive what it feels like to be alive.
The profound redness of a red apple, the sharp, visceral feeling of a needle prick, the bitter taste of black coffee. Science has struggled for centuries with what is called the hard problem of consciousness.
The seemingly impossible question of how unconscious, dead physical matter in the brain can somehow generate a vivid subjective feeling.
And Lillian is claiming that the mathematical answer lies hidden in the dimensional band between 2.70D and 2.50D.
Let's trace the precise logic of this descent. At the 2.70D layer, bounded physical structure is completely finished.
A cell is built.
The SU3 boundary is perfectly sealed. The geometry is maximally chemically projectable into matter. The framework argues that any further dimensional reduction below 2.70D cannot produce a new physical force, nor can it yield a new, heavier particle or a new geometric generator algebra.
So let's hit the bottom.
At 2.70D, the universe has hit the absolute rock-bottom limit of external physical expression.
But the reduction pressure is still applying force. So if it has hit the absolute floor of physical reality, what happens to the energy? It can't just evaporate.
It undergoes a profound geometric event that the text refers to simply as the reversal.
The reversal.
Because the geometric closure has completely exhausted its capacity to extend externally into outward physical space, the physical structure inverts, the dimensional pressure bounces off the floor, and turns inward.
It turns inward. When I was trying to visualize the mechanics of the reversal, I pictured a heavy brass bell.
Okay, a bell.
Imagine you ring this bell, but the bell is suspended inside a tiny, flawlessly sealed, indestructible titanium vault. The sound waves produced by the bell physically cannot project outward into the environment. There is absolutely no external extension mathematically possible.
Right, because of the vault.
So what happens to all that acoustic energy? It reverberates violently inward. It bounces endlessly off the perfect internal boundary, compounding on itself, turning the entire interior volume of the vault into a vibrating, resonant, highly pressurized hum.
That is an incredibly evocative and accurate analogy for the physics Lillian is describing. The framework defines this absolute limit as the 2.50D floor.
2.50D.
It is crucial to understand that this floor is not the quantum vacuum. It is certainly not the pre-structural, featureless ocean of continuum ontology we started with.
Something else entirely.
It is a strictly post-structural floor. It is the geometric consequence of what happens when a highly structured physical closure hits the absolute bottom limit of physical reality and violently bounces inward upon itself.
And out of this internal reverberation, the text produces the equation of experience, which is simultaneously the simplest and most profound equation in the paper.
Structure leads to structural residue, which leads to qualia.
Structure becomes hum.
Structure becomes hum. That is the exact poetic phrase the text uses to describe the phenomenon.
It's beautiful.
This is a staggering ontological claim about the nature of the mind. It argues mathematically that consciousness, our subjective qualia, is not some magical, ethereal ghost in the machine that gets arbitrarily added to physical matter later in evolution when brains suddenly become sufficiently complex.
Right.
Qualia is the literal mathematical interior residue of a physical geometric structure. Subjective experience is simply what a completed physical closure feels like from the inside once it mathematically loses the ability to extend on the outside.
Structure becomes hum. I genuinely get chills thinking about the implications of that phrase. It implies that consciousness is not a biological accident. It is not an illusion. It is the inescapable, inevitable geometric reverberation of a closed biological system hitting the dimensional floor of reality.
It is the ultimate synthesis of physics and consciousness.
Yeah.
When the geometry of life reaches the absolute floor of physical reality at 2.5D, it bounces inward as subjective conscious experience. Qualionomics treats the mind not as a separate substance, but as the interior trace of a completed adaptive closure.
Wow. Okay. We need to take a massive collective breath. Let's do a rapid-fire summary of this incredibly dense, awe-inspiring journey we just took. We started in the absolute void with homilectic coherence, an infinite, featureless ocean of pure, unbroken potential.
That ocean began to concentrate locally, creating density gradients,
Which created directional flow.
which twisted into anisotropic torsion,
Which stabilized into a chiral handedness.
which finally sealed itself off into a distinct boundary.
And that profound sequence generated FCHP geometry, bestowing upon the universe the strict, life-admissible rules of directional torsion, stable chirality, a sealed boundary, and the capacity for gradient retention.
Which then stepped down through the turbulent slush of the atomic continuum ontology.
The active transition zone, where abstract geometry was written into matter as the fundamental grammar of reality.
Descending down the strict infraterior reduction stack, from the pre-generated curve of the 3.14D gateway, dropping to the 3.000D co-emergence of spatial orientation and rhythmic phase pulse.
Twisting through the 2.85D chiral SU2 layer, and finally locking shut at the 2.70D confinement layer.
A master toolbox of exactly 15 generators, leaving behind the invariant numerical scars of pi, Euler's number E, and the golden ratio phi.
Which then physically projected out into atomic chemistry. The abstract geometry materialized as physically folded proteins, exclusively left-handed amino acids, spherical lipid membranes, and the electrical battery of metabolic proton gradients.
Which then achieved the miraculous state of derived ontology, igniting into a fully adaptive, self-maintaining biological cell that actively senses and regulates its own boundaries.
Utilizing disequilibrium and physically passing its geometric closure constraints down to the next generation of life.
And finally, that physical biological closure descended all the way to the 2.50D reversal floor,
where the structure exhausted its ability to extend outward into the physical universe and instead violently inverted inward.
where physical structure became the resonant hum of subjective consciousness itself.
It is, without question, an incredibly heavy, demanding framework to process. But it is also mathematically beautiful.
It completely reorients how we view our existence and our place in the cosmos.
It forces us to realize that we are not random biological accidents swimming in a dead, indifferent chemical soup. We are the ultimate adaptive expression of a deep, purposeful geometric architecture.
Life is chemically expressed, but geometrically admitted.
It always has been. The geometry simply waited for the chemistry to catch up. I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. If Philip Lillian's staggering framework is right, then the physical lipid boundaries of your body, the chemical proton gradients keeping your heart beating in your chest right now, and the very subjective, conscious feeling you have of listening to my voice at this exact moment. Wait, I said no ellipses. Let me rephrase. And the very subjective, conscious feeling you have of listening to my voice at this exact moment, they are not separate phenomena. They're all made of the exact same underlying geometric material. They're just vibrating and resonating at different dimensional floors of the cosmic stack. You aren't just a physical object that was dropped into the universe. You are the universe's geometry, intricately folded, securely bounded, and finally experiencing itself from the inside out.